Now, some much needed coronavirus perspective. People more and more are talking about it. I've been talking about it. Again, nobody's trying to downplay this virus, certainly not me. But I want you to take a look at the monitor for a moment. And I want you to take a look at this. And this is information that's pulled up from the CDC. This is where most of this information comes from. And I looked at this yesterday myself. The number of people who died in the United States last year from strep throat, 1,900. From food poisoning, 3,000. From choking, 5,000. From accidental hanging, wow, almost 7,000. Hit by cars, almost 7,500. Obesity, 7,740. Pregnancy-related, over 12,000. Inflammation resulting from food or liquids getting into the lungs, over 20,000. Next, please. Antibiotic resistance bacteria, 35,000. Alcohol-induced deaths, mostly liver failure and so forth, almost 36,000. Falls, people who fall down, often the elderly and the handicapped, over 36,000. Blood poisoning resulting from bacteria, around 41,000. Now this is shocking and upsetting. Suicide, over 47,000. And unfortunately, I think what we're going to see in 2020, given the economy shut down, much of it, widespread unemployment and growing, business failures and growing, my fear is you're going to see that suicide number increase. The president has talked about this too. So when you shut down an economy, or big chunks of it, it has health effects, many, many health effects, including people who go into deep depression and people who harm themselves because they lose everything and they can't care for their families. Flu and pneumonia, and they're often related. I had the flu 2 years ago, and I had pneumonia. Almost 56,000 deaths. Now, let's just wait there a second. Now, imagine every year, if we had the charts that the news media put out these days, the number of cases of confirmed flu and the number of cases of confirmed death as a result of the flu. And they put that up there every day, every day, every day, every day. That would affect the way you live, wouldn't it? That would affect the way you conduct your lives. I'm telling you this for a reason. I believe we should do the very best we can to follow the guidance that the president and others are putting out. But I'm also torn a bit because I'm very concerned about how the media and others are pushing numbers. So if every single year you would have these charts throughout flu season, day in and day out, and doctors and hospital people and other experts on TV 24/7 talking about the flu epidemic, or maybe pandemic for that matter. Can you imagine how the country would really be destroyed from within? And this happens every flu season. And the thing about the flu typically is it changes. And these vaccines that they produce really are aimed at one particular flu or another. But I want you to keep something in mind. We have vaccines for flu, right, Mr. Producer? We have vaccines. And look at the death rate. Almost 56,000. Just think about that. Accidental poisoning. Almost 65,000. Next, please. Diabetes. Over 83,000. Alzheimer's. When's the last time anybody talked about that or had charts out? 121,000. Chronic lower respiratory disease. 160,000. All accidental deaths. 170,000. Medical errors. 250,000. Cancer, 600,000. Heart disease, which includes heart attacks and so forth, 650,000. I'll leave that up there, please. The coronavirus isn't going to come close to any of the top causes of death in this country. People die in this country. I think I read somewhere several thousand a day. I mean, for a whole host of reasons. For a whole host of reasons. So this, again, is just some perspective. 650,000 a year die of heart disease, heart attacks and so forth, strokes, and 600,000 from cancer every single year. Every single year. Now, I know this is very, very serious, and when we talk numbers, it seems so inhumane. But they're always talking numbers, so I guess I need to talk numbers and stats. When you look at New York City, Governor Cuomo said today that they expect maybe 16,000 deaths from this. That's a lot of dead people. And it's a terrible, terrible thing. 16,000. How many people have died in New York City last year from heart disease? I have no idea. From cancer? I have no idea. From Alzheimer's? I don't have any idea. And nobody's going to check it, are they? Nobody's going to check it. So it's very, very important to keep some of this in some kind of perspective, because I'm just concerned with these charts and the graphics and the cherry picking of guests that the media are. I'm not saying they're making more out of this than it is, but they're panicking people. And in terms of the priority of death, more of you will die from heart disease, cancer, medical errors, all accidents, deaths, Alzheimer's, and likely diabetes than will die from the coronavirus. All the information I've looked at from top scholars, whether they're Yale or Stanford or other places, in addition to listening to Fauci and Birx, but all of them are saying 1% or less. So that means 99%, really over 99% of the people who get this coronavirus are going to live. I wish 99% of people who got cancer would live, or chronic heart disease would live, or Alzheimer's would live. So again, a little perspective. And the reason a little perspective is needed is, again, because of the hyper reporting that's taking place. And also, you know, when you move this many resources into one thing, like the coronavirus, I have to assume that hospital resources and R&D and our labs and all the rest are taking a focus off of other issues, whether it's cancer, Alzheimer's, diabetes, and heart disease, and so forth, and now focusing it on the pandemic. Again, some of that's understandable. But we don't have a real grasp on just how understandable that is, if you understand the point that I'm making, and I think you do. I want to talk about the rate of people who are dying as a result of getting coronavirus when we return. But one of the things I want you to keep in mind, no one has yet told me, and there's not a publication that I can find out there, scholarly, scientific, or otherwise, on how they are defining death. I understand death, the brain and the heart stops, but I mean death related to this virus. For all we know, it's death related to heart disease, but the virus is the last thing that pushes somebody over the edge. We'll be right back. Welcome back, America. There was a study done recently, and our friends at the Daily Wire published this yesterday, and I want you to hear about this. In early March, World Health Organization Director General Tedros Adhanom, and I can't pronounce his last name, and I'm not going to even try with all those consonants, but by the way, he's a mouthpiece and a hack for communist China, said the estimated mortality rate of COVID-19 globally was about 3.4%. That's massive. While Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, said it could be anywhere from 1% to 2%. You just do the math, he said, based on initial reports out of other countries. Well, the math may have been right, but that number is wrong. And what Fauci now says, and of course we all know this, is that when you look at the models, you try and draw conclusions. But it all depends what you put into the models. And this is something I want to stress with you. What we're hearing right now on a recent call from the WHO this morning is that there aren't as many asymptomatic cases as we think, which made them elevate, I think, what their mortality is, Fauci explained in the first week of March. You know as well as anybody that the mortality for seasonal flu is 0.1%. So even if it goes down to 1%, it's still 10 times more fatal. I have no idea why he's talking like this. When you don't have a firm grasp on all the cases, on the universe of numbers, on the denominator, when you're playing around with the denominator, this doesn't really help. As reported by CNN Tuesday, a new study published in Lancet estimates that even the lower end 1% fatality rate estimation is too high. We've been talking about this right here and on my radio show. A more accurate estimation of the percentage of people who will die due to complications from the virus, researchers say, is about 2/3 of that, or 0.66%, under 1%. That coronavirus death rate, which is lower than earlier estimates, takes into account potentially milder cases that often go undiagnosed. But it's still far higher than the 0.1% of people who are killed by the flu, CNN explains. When undetected infections aren't taken into account, the Lancet study found that the coronavirus death rate was 1.38%, more consistent with earlier reports. But why does that make any sense? In other words, if you have limited testing, the mortality rate percentage goes up. But that's the problem with limited testing. If every person in America was tested, what you would find as a rational matter, projected from any model, is that the mortality rate would go way down, because the vast majority of Americans are unaffected or slightly affected or even badly affected by the virus, but aren't dying. So as noted by CNN, when Dr. Fauci presented his 2% estimation in March, he stressed that determining the true death rate requires accurate data on the number of people who have contracted the virus but are asymptomatic or show no symptoms, as a metric that has been glaringly lacking thus far and still is. Now, I criticize this, and I criticize this media with the charts on the screen. The way they've been reporting this, or just pushing this, on Life, Liberty, and Levin on Fox the other day. And as a result, at least one media organization has now said at least the number of cases and at least the number of deaths. So at least the number of confirmed cases is correct. It's a correct notation. But at least the number of deaths is not a correct notation, because that death number could be much lower. Is the coronavirus the principal reason these people are dying when they put that number up? Or is it among many, if not the lacking, that is the last reason those people are dying? It is the final push, if you will. This is a very important article as far as I'm concerned, because it underscores what I've been talking about. Now, to continue here, I want to do this again, and I've done it on this program before. Dr. Anthony Fauci, on January 26th of this year, 9 weeks ago, almost 2 months ago, give or take. And I don't do this to attack the man. I do this to explain something to you. Here he is with John Castimetis on Cat's Roundtable, which is a podcast. It was on WNYM 970 AM New York, January 26, 2020, and the guest is Dr. Fauci. So let's listen to this again. Go.
What can you tell the American people about what's going on? Should they be scared?
I don't think so. The American people should not be worried or frightened by this. It's a very, very low risk to the United States, but it's something that we as public health officials need to take very seriously. This is a virus that has emerged and jumped species from an animal reservoir. Now we have an evolving situation of many cases that are now evolving more and more each day, but it's gone beyond just this epicenter in a city called Wuhan, W-U-H-A-N, in central China. But now it's the people infected in other cities, including Beijing, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. And there's been now people who've traveled from there and have gotten sick in places like Thailand, Japan, and South Korea. We know now there has been a case that has been in the United States, and that's someone who traveled to Wuhan, came back without any symptoms, developed symptoms, and luckily the health providers were alert enough and astute enough to identify the person and isolate them, and that person is now in isolation doing very well. So it's an evolving situation, John, of a virus that has been essentially non-existent in humans until it made this jump in China, and now we have on our hands an outbreak. Having said that, getting back to your first question, it isn't something that the American public needs to worry about or be frightened about, because we have ways of preparing, of screening, of people coming in, and we have ways of responding, like we did with this one case in Seattle, Washington, who had traveled to China and brought back the infection.
Okay. People say the president needs to follow the science. Well, that was the science right there, right? On January 26th, 9 weeks ago, give or take. 9 weeks ago. 4 or 5 weeks later, the 5 alarm bells go off. The sirens are going off. That, as I just read to you, wow, we could lose over 3% of the population that gets the virus. We're talking about an enormous number. Then they walked that back a couple of weeks ago, the scientists, the experts, and said, well, it's not going to be 3%, 2%, 1%. You just heard it's going to be likely under 1%. They're trying to project from information they're getting from China, but China lies about its data. They're trying to project from information they're getting from Italy, which has been ravaged, but Italy's not the United States, and Italy's situation with Red China has been and is much different in terms of the number of Chinese that come into northern Italy and work in those factories and so forth. So we're not Italy. People look at South Korea, they look at Singapore, Japan, they're looking at Spain, which is taking it in the neck right now. Looking at all these countries, trying to make projections and so forth. And so what's happening? We're getting whiplash. We know this is a very bad illness, and we know people can die from it. But we don't exactly know what the data is telling us, and so we get this kind of whiplash. And so the President of the United States is trying to follow the scientists. He's trying to follow that man, as well as Dr. Deborah Birx. And so when he comes out and he speaks, and they say, well, early on, you didn't think this was such a big deal, did he? Now you say it's up to 1.5 to 2.1 million who could have died. I don't believe that figure either, by the way. If mitigation hadn't taken place, as I explained on radio last night, mitigation would always take place, whether the government orders or not. If you see people dying, fairly numerous numbers of them on your streets and the restaurants or whatever, as I said last night, you're going to mitigate. You might stay home. I mean, I know my family and I, we didn't overdo it, but we ordered some masks when they were telling us not to get masks. We ordered some gloves. Probably don't have enough of anything, but that's what we did, even though they said not to do it. You're an individual citizen and human being who has to make your own decisions. My daughter decided to hold my granddaughter from school, even before the school had let out. So people are going to make these decisions. So are governors, so are mayors, and frankly, so is the president. So to say that it would have been 1.5 to 2.1 million deaths, and they don't know that, but let's just play along. If that were the case, if there was no mitigation, there was always going to be some kind of mitigation. Just as there's always going to be pharmaceutical companies that see a problem, they're going to try and address it. So that number doesn't make sense to me, and yet it's out there. And yesterday, we had Dr. Birx and Fauci, but particularly Birx, saying, hey, look, even if we do everything we're telling you to do, 100,000 to 200,000, really 100,000 to 240,000 people might still die in the United States. And then I read an article where what the White House is actually being told by the experts is maybe around 82,000. We've gone from not a big deal to a huge deal to 1.5 million, to 2.1 million, to under 1%, well, to maybe 100,000 to 240,000. What does this all mean to you? Just protect yourselves and protect your family as best you can. But for the media, what does it mean? Attack the president. Vox is a left-wing site. What's the headline say? U.S. coronavirus deaths, Trump moves goalposts, says 200,000 could die from COVID-19. Trump is not saying that. He's following the science. His scientists and health experts, public health experts, who've been around for decades dealing with one virus after another, they told him that, and at the press conference, he embraced it. Months ago, he embraced it when they were basically comparing this to the flu. It's not Trump who's lacking in leadership or anything of the sort. He's following the science. The problem is the science is imperfect. And it's going to continue to be imperfect until we get more data, which is why the tests are so crucial, which is why the administration is pushing tests out there as fast as they can and testing people as fast as they can. Now, over 1.1 million have been tested. I mean, the ultimate goal, I don't see how it happens, would be if everyone's tested, so we know exactly what's going on with the virus, but it's really not possible. But there's a lot of issues that go into testing. What pool do you test? What geographic area do you test? What percentage of the population? And they're still trying to get their hands around it. More on this when I return.